There is a moment standing in a frost-hardened field at dawn, when modern gear fails you in ways no product review ever warned you about. The membrane jacket crinkles like plastic wrap. The synthetic base layer, soaked from last night's exertion, sits cold and clammy against your skin, and somewhere in the back of your mind a question forms. How did men survive winters far more brutal than this, wearing nothing but tightly woven wool and leather? The answer, buried in the mud of World War I trenches and the forgotten fieldcraft of an earlier century, is more relevant today than any gear catalogue will admit. This is not nostalgia. This is pattern recognition. Picture the Western Front, winter of 1916. The air carries the smell of wet earth, wood smoke, and a cold that settles into your bones before dawn and just refuses to leave. Men stood for hours in water, reaching their ankles in trenches, stretching miles like open wounds across the landscape. The sounds were relentless: distant artillery, freezing groundwater dripping through sandbag walls, the muffled coughing of men trying not to be heard. Surviving this environment was never about having the right gear. It was about understanding how the human body loses heat, and then systematically fighting every single mechanism of that loss. The soldiers who lasted were not the strongest. They were the ones who paid attention, drawing on centuries of military and agricultural fieldcraft that modern survivalists are only now beginning to rediscover. A British infantryman's wool greatcoat in 1914 was not a fashion choice. It was a survival system, refined across generations. Wool absorbs up to 30% of its own weight in moisture before it begins to feel wet against the skin, and even then, a biochemical process within the fibre generates a small but measurable amount of heat as it absorbs, a phenomenon called heat absorption. In a frozen trench, the difference between damp and warm and wet and freezing is the difference between function and hypothermia. Modern synthetic fleece, by contrast, loses its loft and insulating structure when saturated, offering little of the resilience that wool maintains under the same conditions. The charcoal and dark grey tones common to military wool of earlier centuries served a purpose that serious cold-weather practitioners are rediscovering. Dark fibres absorb solar radiation across a broader spectrum than light-coloured synthetics, converting low winter sunlight directly into surface warmth. On a clear January morning in northern France, a soldier in a dark wool coat standing in a sunlit trench section was harvesting heat that his companion, in lighter kit, was reflecting away. Small advantages, compounded across hours of brutal exposure, determined who remained capable of functioning when the order came. When official shelter failed, and in the trenches it frequently did, soldiers fell back on instincts older than any military manual. They scraped funk holes into trench walls, wedging their bodies inside and using the earth itself as insulation against wind and radiation cooling. Empty sandbags wrapped around boots broke the wind and added a critical dead air layer. Newspapers pressed between uniform layers trapped still air, the true insulating medium, regardless of what contains it. Men twisted straw into crude mattresses to lift themselves off the frozen ground, instinctively avoiding the conductive heat loss that comes from direct contact with cold earth. For water they read sources carefully, boiling when fuel allowed, and collecting rainwater from oilskin capes during storms. They ate slowly and consistently, brewed tea with a persistence bordering on ritual, understanding intuitively what science now confirms, that warmth restores morale and the will to continue when cold has made everything feel impossible. What the men of the Western Front understood, and what experienced bushcraft practitioners rediscover every generation, is that survival is never about a single piece of gear. It is a layered, adaptive system, deeply informed by the environment you are actually in, not the one a manufacturer imagined when designing your jacket. The charcoal wool coat was the product of centuries of iterative learning by people for whom staying warm was not a hobby, but a condition of existence. That knowledge deserves to be carried forward. If this episode changed how you think about cold weather survival, share it with someone who values self-reliance, history, and the art of staying alive when comfort is no longer an option. Subscribe to Fieldcraft Chronicles and never miss the knowledge that gets lost between the history books and the hiking store. The past has more to teach us than we have yet been willing to learn.